December 8, 1941. A humid morning spread over Clark Field, the main U.S. air base north of Manila. The previous day, and as shocking news, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had barely settled among the troops of the Far East Air Force when a deep, unmistakable drone rolled across the horizon. Lieutenant Charles Chuck Bond of the 20th Pursuit Squadron squinted upward, shielding his eyes from the tropical glare. "Must be our boys from Del Monte," he muttered, assuming the approaching formation of aircraft were American B-17s returning from Mindanao. But within seconds, the illusion shattered. Black crosses flashed on wings, the rising sun insignia of the Imperial Japanese Air Force. At 12:35 p.m., without warning, 54 Mitsubishi G4M and G4M bombers, escorted by 80 Agile Zero fighters, descended in perfect V formations over Clark Field. Within minutes, the serene Philippine sky erupted into a furnace. Bombs struck hangars, fuel dumps, and parked aircraft. The ground trembled as explosions tore through lines of B-17 Flying Fortresses and P-40 Warhawks, many still idle on the tarmac. Flames devoured the runway. Men scrambled for cover, some firing pistols helplessly at streaking Zeros. Sergeant Ramon Manalo, a Filipino ground crewman, later recalled, "The first blast lifted me off the ground. I thought the sun itself had fallen." In less than 45 minutes, America's Far East Air Force lost half its combat planes, before many had even left the ground. Smoke rose in oily columns visible for miles. Across the island of Luzon, similar destruction unfolded. At Nichols Field near Manila and Iba Air Base on the west coast, the Japanese struck with mechanical precision. By sundown, the defenders' ability to contest the skies was gone. The invasion of the Philippines had begun. MacArthur's dilemma. At the penthouse of the Manila Hotel, General Douglas MacArthur received the reports in stunned silence. His strategy, based on defending the entire archipelago, was now untenable. Communications with Washington crackled with urgency, but the damage was irreversible. In Tokyo, Imperial headquarters rejoiced. For months, they had studied MacArthur's deployments. Their plan, Operation M, called for rapid landings on northern and southern Luzon to encircle Manila. Without air cover, the defenders could not resist. On December 10th, Japanese troops landed at Apari and Vigan in northern Luzon. 2 days later, another force stormed ashore at Legazpi in the south. Like a tightening noose, the invaders began advancing inland. In a desperate bid to slow them, Filipino and American troops fought small delaying actions across highways and rice paddies, but they faced a relentless enemy. The fall of Manila. By December 22nd, the main Japanese invasion force, over 40,000 troops under Lieutenant General Masaharu Hama, landed at Lingayen Gulf. The defenders' resistance was brave but disorganized. Units like the 26th Cavalry Regiment, composed mainly of Filipino scouts, fought valiantly against tanks with rifles and grenades. One of their actions near De Mortis would become legendary. A cavalry charge, the last in U.S. military history. Major Edwin Ramsey led his men on horseback against Japanese infantry. "We drew our sabers and charged," he later wrote. "It was madness, but it bought precious time." Despite these acts of valor, the Japanese advance was unstoppable. On December 26th, Manila was declared an open city to spare it from destruction. MacArthur relocated his headquarters to Corregidor Island at the mouth of Manila Bay. By New Year's Day, 1942, the battered Allied forces withdrew into the Bataan Peninsula, a rugged, jungle-clad region where MacArthur hoped to hold out until reinforcements arrived. Washington's promise was clear. Help is on the way. But help would never come. The Battle of Bataan begins. On January 7th, Japanese troops reached the defensive lines in Bataan. Facing them were roughly 80,000 exhausted men, 2/3 Filipino, 1/3 American, backed by outdated artillery and dwindling rations. Disease, hunger, and malaria stalked their trenches as relentlessly as bullets. Yet morale held firm. Soldiers dug foxholes, strung barbed wire, and prepared to fight. Behind every rifle stood a story. A farm boy from Iowa, a student from Manila, a miner from Baguio, a mechanic from San Francisco. Private Antonio Cruz of the 21st Division wrote in his diary, "We may be starving, but we are not surrendering. Bataan will be our fortress." For weeks, the defenders held their ground. Japanese assaults met with fierce resistance. The battles of Abukai and Pilar saw hand-to-hand combat in the dense jungle. The enemy, expecting an easy victory, found themselves mired in a campaign that stretched their logistics to the limit. Hama, humiliated by delays, requested reinforcements. Tokyo obliged, but warned him to end the campaign quickly. Life in the jungle conditions in Bataan deteriorated rapidly. Food supplies dwindled to one-third rations. Men boiled shoe leather and wild roots to survive. Dysentery and malaria swept through camps. Ammunition ran low. Nurses in field hospitals, later called the Angels of Bataan, worked miracles with rags and makeshift medicine. Lieutenant Florence Finch later recalled, "We had no morphine, no bandages. We tore up shirts and prayed." Yet amidst the suffering, camaraderie grew. Filipino and American soldiers shared everything: tobacco, rice, even humor. "We learned to laugh at death," said Corporal Joe Esquivel, "because crying didn't help." Corregidor, the island fortress. While the battle raged in Bataan, across the bay lay Corregidor Island, a rocky fortress bristling with coastal guns. Beneath its surface ran the Malinta Tunnel, a vast, bomb-proof network serving as MacArthur's headquarters and hospital. From here, radio operators sent coded messages to Washington and Australia. "Bataan is holding," they reported in January. "We are fighting on." But by March, the truth was grim. Supplies were gone. Soldiers were fainting in battle. Japanese artillery pounded positions day and night. On March 11th, under direct orders from President Roosevelt, MacArthur reluctantly left Corregidor for Australia. Before departing, he vowed, "I shall return." His men, left behind in Bataan and Corregidor, clung to that promise like scripture. Prelude to collapse. By early April, Japanese reinforcements arrived, 50,000 strong. The final assault began on April 3rd. Artillery fire rained across Mount Samat, reducing trenches to dust. Soldiers too weak to stand manned their positions until overrun. General Edward King, realizing the futility, faced an impossible choice. With his men starving, diseased, and out of ammunition, he decided to surrender. On April 9, 1942, after 3 months of relentless defense, Bataan fell. April 9, 1942. The guns fell silent over the Bataan Peninsula. After 3 months of unimaginable endurance, disease, and hunger, the last defenders of the Philippines laid down their arms. Around 76,000 soldiers, about 64,000 Filipinos and 12,000 Americans, became prisoners of the Japanese Empire. General Edward King, Jr., with tears in his eyes, surrendered his gaunt, fever-ridden men to the enemy near Mariveles. "There is nothing left to fight with," he said. "To continue would mean massacre." The Japanese commander accepted his surrender, but what awaited these men was far worse than King could imagine. The prisoners were ordered to march north toward Camp O'Donnell, a former Philippine Army base about 65 miles away. Many were already too weak to stand. Few had eaten in days. Under the tropical sun, they began what would become one of the most infamous atrocities of the Second World War, the Bataan Death March. The march begins. At first, confusion reigned. Japanese officers barked orders in clipped tones, forcing columns of prisoners to move in the blazing heat. Men were stripped of watches, helmets, and personal belongings. Canteens were confiscated. Those who faltered were beaten with rifle butts. Some were bayoneted on the spot. The Japanese guards, many hardened by years of brutal warfare in China, viewed surrender as dishonor. To them, these prisoners were beneath contempt. Private Jack Wilson of the 31st Infantry later recalled, "You'd see a man stumble, and before he could get up, a bayonet would find him. You learned not to look." By the first night, bodies already lined the road. The air reeked of blood, sweat, and decay. Thirst and torture temperatures soared above 100 degrees. The prisoners, deprived of food and water, grew delirious. Some risked their lives to scoop muddy water from roadside ditches. Others drank from carabao wallows filled with disease. Japanese guards laughed and sometimes shot men for attempting to drink. Others forced captives to sit in the sun for hours without shade, an execution method known as the sun treatment. Filipino civilians, horrified by the sight of the starving columns, tried to pass food or water, but many were beaten or killed for their compassion. A Filipino villager named Maria Santos remembered, "We saw them, hundreds, thousands, skeletons walking. We threw bananas and rice balls, but the guards fired at us. I can still hear the shots." For 5 days and nights, the march continued. Prisoners stumbled through dust and heat, collapsing from exhaustion. Trucks carrying Japanese officers roared past, indifferent to the groans of the dying. The Road of Death. Along the road to San Fernando, death was constant. Men who fell were crushed by passing vehicles or executed where they lay. Sometimes the Japanese forced groups of prisoners to bury the dead under the very roads they marched upon. Those who survived long enough to reach San Fernando were herded into makeshift pens, given a handful of rice, and then crammed into steel boxcars for transport north. Each boxcar, built for 40 men, was stuffed with over 100. Inside, there was no air, no light, and no mercy. Prisoners fainted and suffocated where they stood. When the doors finally opened hours later, bodies tumbled out onto the tracks. From Capas, the survivors were forced to march the final miles to Camp O'Donnell. Out of the 76,000 who began the march, an estimated 10,000 to 15,000 died along the way. Private Leon Beck later said, "I stopped counting the dead after the first 100. There was no room for numbers, only horror." Camp O'Donnell. A living hell. Camp O'Donnell, the final destination, proved to be no salvation. It was a barren, disease-ridden prison where starvation and sickness claimed hundreds of lives every day. There was no medicine, no sanitation, and almost no food. Prisoners drank from muddy ditches shared with water buffalo. Dysentery spread like wildfire. The stench of death filled the air. Filipino soldiers died by the thousands. American prisoners, too, succumbed to malaria, beriberi, and despair. Father William Cummings, a Catholic chaplain imprisoned there, became a source of hope to many. His simple words echoed across the camp. "There are no atheists in foxholes, nor in prison camps." But even faith struggled against the horror. Bodies were carted daily to mass graves outside the wire. By June, nearly half the Filipino prisoners were dead. Resistance and courage. Yet, amid the darkness, courage persisted. Filipino civilians risked their lives to smuggle food and medicine to the prisoners. Underground resistance groups began forming across Luzon, aided by villagers and former soldiers who had escaped capture. Among them was Captain Nieves Fernandez, a Filipino schoolteacher who turned guerrilla fighter. With a bolo knife and a handful of men, she ambushed Japanese patrols in Samar, inspiring hundreds to join the resistance. In the mountains of northern Luzon, U.S. Army Major Wendell Fertig organized guerrilla units that later provided intelligence to MacArthur's returning forces. Despite the suffering on Bataan, the spirit of defiance refused to die. Corregidor under siege. While the survivors of Bataan endured captivity, the island fortress of Corregidor continued to resist. Japanese bombers pounded it daily, reducing its tunnels and fortifications to rubble. Inside Malinta Tunnel, the wounded filled every corridor. Doctors worked by candlelight. Ammunition ran dangerously low. Nurses tore uniforms into bandages. General Jonathan Wainwright, now in command after MacArthur's departure, wired Washington. Enemy artillery inflicts heavy casualties. Situation desperate. On May 5, 1942, Japanese troops launched their final assault, landing on Corregidor's beaches under cover of night. Fierce fighting erupted among the cliffs and tunnels. By morning, the defenders were overwhelmed. At noon, on May 6th, Wainwright made the agonizing decision to surrender. Corregidor fell, marking the end of organized Allied resistance in the Philippines. The Japanese flag rose over the island, but its victory came at a cost. Thousands of Japanese soldiers had been killed or wounded in the campaign, and the defenders' courage had stunned Tokyo. I shall return. From Australia, MacArthur listened to the radio reports with grim resolve. He issued a message to the Filipino people. To the soldiers of Bataan, you have fought the bravest fight in military history. The world will remember you. I shall return. Those words became a rallying cry across the Pacific. For the prisoners suffering in camps and the guerrillas fighting in the jungles, MacArthur's promise was not just rhetoric. It was hope. Aftermath of Bataan. The Japanese believed the fall of the Philippines would secure their southern flank and protect access to vital resources in the Dutch East Indies. But the brutality of their occupation had the opposite effect. News of the Bataan Death March, when it reached America months later, ignited outrage. Newspapers called it a march through hell. War bond drives soared. Recruitment surged. Bataan became a symbol, not of defeat, but of sacrifice and resilience. It marked the beginning of America's long road back across the Pacific. The surrender of Bataan and Corregidor in 1942 marked the darkest hour in Philippine and American history. Yet, amid the ashes of defeat, a new kind of war ignited, one fought not with divisions and air fleets, but with whispers in the jungle, coded messages, and the courage of ordinary men and women who refused to yield. Across the mountains and islands of the archipelago, thousands of soldiers who escaped capture formed guerrilla units. Peasants, fishermen, and students joined them. From the northern peaks of Luzon to the swamps of Mindanao, a vast underground resistance began to rise. Japan controlled the cities, ports, and roads. But beyond the reach of their garrisons, the wilderness belonged to the guerrillas. The birth of the resistance. The Japanese occupation brought cruelty and fear. Civilians were forced into labor, villages burned, food confiscated, and anyone suspected of aiding guerrillas executed. Yet, instead of breaking the spirit of the people, these acts hardened their resolve. In the Visayas, Captain Jesus Villamor, an ace Filipino pilot who had fought in the early days of the invasion, became one of the first to organize resistance cells. Using hidden radios and local spies, his group relayed intelligence about Japanese troop movements to American submarines patrolling offshore. In Mindanao, Colonel Wendell Fertig, an American engineer who refused to surrender, emerged as a legendary figure. With a ragged band of Filipino fighters, he proclaimed himself commander of the United States forces in the Philippines, Mindanao, and set up a shadow government. Lacking proper weapons, his men used captured rifles, homemade explosives, and even bows and arrows. Fertig's message was simple: we are still fighting. Life in the jungle. For the guerrillas, survival was a daily struggle. They lived off the land, moving constantly through dense jungle to avoid Japanese patrols. Food was scarce. Malaria and leeches were constant companions. Messages were carried by barefoot couriers through mountain trails. Small victories, a derailed train, a sabotaged supply depot, an ambushed convoy, were celebrated as major triumphs. Lieutenant Pedro Guerrero of the Luzon Guerrilla Force recalled, We had no uniforms, no pay, and no medicine, but we had the will to fight. Every Japanese soldier we killed meant one step closer to freedom. Villagers became their lifeline. Women smuggled food and ammunition hidden inside baskets of rice. Farmers passed coded notes disguised as letters about harvest schedules. Even school teachers and priests joined the network, sheltering fugitives and transmitting messages in Latin phrases or hymns. The jungle war was invisible but relentless. The Japanese counterinsurgency. The Japanese military soon realized that the guerrillas were more than an irritation. They were a strategic threat. By 1943, intelligence reports warned that large portions of the countryside were effectively out of Japanese control. In response, they unleashed brutal counterinsurgency operations. Entire villages were wiped out under suspicion of harboring rebels. Civilians were tortured to extract information. Colonel Nagayoshi of the 14th Army issued an infamous order: "Kill all who resist, burn all who shelter the enemy." Yet, despite the terror, the resistance only grew. Each atrocity convinced more Filipinos to join the underground. The underground in Manila. Even in the occupied capital, the resistance thrived. The Free Philippines newspaper, printed secretly on mimeograph machines, circulated under the noses of Japanese police. Its editors risked execution daily to deliver news from Allied radio broadcasts. Underground operatives like José Laurel III and journalist Antonio Escoda coordinated with guerrilla leaders through clandestine couriers. Escoda's wife, Josefa Llanes Escoda, founder of the Girl Scouts of the Philippines, became a symbol of quiet heroism, smuggling supplies to prisoners in Fort Santiago until her arrest and execution in 1945. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, was a statement. The Philippines was conquered, but not subdued. Allied links and secret radios. By 1943, contact between the Philippine resistance and Allied headquarters in Australia was re-established. Using homemade radio transmitters, often built from scavenged parts, guerrillas transmitted coded intelligence about Japanese troop movements, shipping routes, and airfields. In Leyte, a young operator known as Miss U sent daily reports under constant risk of discovery. Her signals guided American submarines to Japanese convoys, saving countless Allied lives. MacArthur's intelligence chief, Major Charles Willoughby, later wrote, "Without the guerrillas' radio network, our campaign to retake the Philippines would have been blind." Submarines also began surfacing along remote beaches, delivering supplies, radios, and small arms to the resistance. Filipino fishermen guided them through reefs by starlight. One American officer who rode these missions later said, "The guerrillas were our eyes. They knew every river, every trail, every Japanese patrol schedule. Without them, the invasion would have taken twice as long." The cost of resistance. But victory came at a price. The Japanese launched savage reprisals wherever guerrillas were active. In Panay, hundreds of civilians were massacred after an ambush. In Cebu, entire families were executed for refusing to reveal hiding places. Captured fighters faced torture and public beheading. The Japanese used fear as their weapon, but the resistance learned to turn that fear into fire. Guerrilla leader Colonel Russell Volkmann described his men's resilience. They had nothing but hope and machetes, and somehow that was enough. By late 1944, an estimated 260,000 Filipinos were engaged in organized guerrilla warfare, supported by millions more civilians. The underground army had become a nation's beating heart, preparing for return. As American forces advanced across the Pacific, through Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Marianas, the long-promised return drew nearer. Guerrillas intensified operations, sabotaging Japanese communication lines and rescuing downed Allied airmen. In Mindoro, they built airstrips from bamboo to prepare for Allied landings. In northern Luzon, Fertig's men mapped every Japanese position, sending detailed intelligence to MacArthur's headquarters. Every whisper through a radio crackle, every ambush on a convoy, every night spent hiding in the rain-soaked jungle was a countdown to liberation. A nation awakens. By mid-1944, the tide had turned. The American victory at the Battle of the Philippine Sea crippled Japan's carrier fleet. Soon after, B-24 bombers began striking the Philippines from newly captured bases. Guerrilla leaders were informed. The return was imminent. Across the islands, secret celebrations broke out. Radios tuned to Allied broadcasts carried MacArthur's words from Australia. "The day of your liberation is near. Rally to me, for the hour of your redemption is at hand." For the men and women who had endured years of hunger, terror, and grief, those words were more than a promise. They were prophecy. The rising sun fades. By the time American planes appeared over Leyte in October 1944, Japan's hold over the Philippines had already begun to crumble from within. Bridges were blown, railways sabotaged, garrisons isolated. The empire's vast military machine was rotting from the roots, undone by the very people it had sought to enslave. When the first American landing craft touched the beaches of Leyte, thousands of Filipino guerrillas emerged from the jungle to join them. Ragged, barefoot, armed with whatever weapons they had scavenged, they saluted the returning soldiers. MacArthur waded ashore and declared, "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil." For the guerrillas, those words were not theater. They were vindication. October 20th, 1944. Dawn broke over the eastern coast of Leyte Island. The surf glowed red beneath the rising sun as thousands of American landing craft churned toward shore. Above them, carrier planes roared in waves, strafing Japanese defenses. For the first time in more than 2.5 years, U.S. soldiers were returning to Philippine soil. Standing aboard the cruiser USS Nashville, General Douglas MacArthur watched the landings unfold through his field glasses. When the first beachhead was secure, he descended into a landing craft with Philippine President Sergio Osmeña and a small staff. As waves splashed against his khaki trousers, cameras captured the moment that would become one of the most iconic in military history. MacArthur stepped ashore and declared into a radio microphone, "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil." The promise made on the ruins of Corregidor had finally been fulfilled. Leyte, gateway to freedom. Leyte's beaches erupted with activity. American infantry, supported by Filipino guerrillas, pushed inland to secure Tacloban and Dulag. Within days, airstrips were established, allowing reinforcements to pour in. The Japanese responded with ferocity, launching counterattacks from the mountains and attempting to strike the landing fleet from the sea. The Battle of Leyte Gulf soon followed, the largest naval battle in history. From October 23 to 26, 1944, over 200,000 sailors and 300 ships clashed across the Philippine Sea. The Japanese committed nearly all remaining warships in a desperate bid to destroy the invasion fleet. But American submarines and carrier aircraft annihilated them. 4 Japanese carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers were lost. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, was broken beyond repair. Admiral William Bull Halsey later said, "After Leyte, the Japanese Navy was a ghost. On land, fighting was brutal. Rain turned rice fields into swamps. Jungle ambushes, sniper fire, and kamikaze raids slowed progress. But the guerrillas, now armed with Allied weapons, guided American troops through hidden trails and reported enemy movements." One soldier wrote in his diary, "They knew every cave, every river. Without them, Leyte would have taken months." By December 25th, Leyte was secured. But ahead lay a far greater challenge: Luzon, the heart of the Philippines and home to Manila. The Battle for Luzon, January the 9th, 1945. More than 175,000 Allied troops stormed the beaches of Lingayen Gulf, the same shores where Japan-EDS invasion had begun 3 years earlier. This time, the tide of war had reversed. Japanese General Tomoyuki Yamashita, known as the Tiger of Malaya, commanded the defense. But he knew defeat was inevitable. Instead of direct confrontation, he planned a brutal war of attrition, retreating into the mountains to prolong resistance. The advance toward Manila was relentless. American and Filipino troops fought through towns reduced to rubble. Japanese soldiers entrenched in caves and tunnels fought to the last man. Kamikaze planes crashed into Allied ships offshore, turning the skies into fire. By early February, the Allies reached the outskirts of Manila. What followed was one of the most tragic urban battles of the Pacific War. The destruction of Manila, once called the Pearl of the Orient, became a city of fire and death. Japanese naval troops refusing to surrender turned its neighborhoods into fortresses. Artillery shells shattered historic buildings. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire. For nearly a month, street fighting raged block by block. American tanks crushed through barricades of rubble while Filipino guerrillas guided soldiers through alleyways. The stench of smoke and death filled the air. By the time the city was liberated on March 3, 1945, over 100,000 civilians had been killed, most massacred by retreating Japanese forces. Churches burned, hospitals were bombed, families were executed in their homes. The Battle of Manila left the capital in ruins. Only shattered walls remained of its beauty. Yet among the ashes, the people's spirit endured. Survivors waved makeshift flags as Allied columns entered the city, shouting, "Mabuhay! Long live America!" The Mountain War. While Manila burned, fierce fighting continued in northern Luzon. General Yamashita withdrew to the Cordillera Mountains, where his troops built elaborate tunnel systems among the granite peaks. There, more than 260,000 Japanese soldiers fought to delay the inevitable. The terrain was brutal. Steep ridges, monsoon rains, and endless jungle. Filipino guerrillas joined the offensive, cutting supply lines and ambushing convoys. Skirmishes turned the mountain passes into killing grounds. Sergeant Rafael de la Cruz, a Filipino scout, recalled, "Every cave had to be cleared by hand grenades. Every ridge cost lives, but we kept climbing." By June, organized resistance collapsed. Yamashita finally surrendered on September 2, 1945. The same day, Japan formally capitulated aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The war was over. The price of liberation. The liberation of the Philippines came at a terrible cost. Nearly 1.1 million Filipinos, soldiers and civilians, died during the war. American forces lost over 14,000 men. Japanese casualties exceeded 330,000. Entire towns were erased. Crops were destroyed, industries shattered, families broken. Yet, from that devastation emerged unity. MacArthur declared, "The valor of the Filipino people and their armed forces is unsurpassed. They fought with a gallantry that will live forever." In Leyte, mass graves were marked with bamboo crosses. In Bataan, survivors of the Death March wept as American flags rose again. Across the islands, bells tolled for the dead, and for a nation reborn. Justice and reckoning. After the war, accountability followed. Japanese commanders were tried for war crimes in Manila. General Masaharu Hama, who had overseen the Bataan campaign, was executed by firing squad in 1946. Yamashita, though he had ordered restraint, was also convicted and hanged for atrocities committed by his troops. His final words were simple, "I believe I have done my duty for my country." The trials stirred debate, but for the survivors of Bataan, for the widows of Manila, and for the burned villages of Luzon, justice, however imperfect, had come. Rebuilding the nation liberation was not the end. it was a beginning. Roads were rebuilt, farms replanted, schools reopened amid ruins. In 1946, the Philippines regained full independence, with Manuel Roxas inaugurated as the first president of the Third Republic. American aid poured in, but the scars of occupation ran deep. Veterans returned home carrying invisible wounds. Survivors of the Death March formed brotherhoods to remember those who never made it back. Every April 9th, they gathered in silent tribute at Mount Samat, where the great white dambana ng Kagitingan, the shrine of valor, now stands overlooking the bay. Beneath it lie the remains of soldiers who fought and died for freedom. Legacy of fire and steel. The story of the Philippines in World War II is not one of conquest or defeat. It is one of endurance. From the jungles of Bataan to the beaches of Leyte, from the tunnels of Corregidor to the ruins of Manila, a nation proved that courage could outlast empires. MacArthur kept his promise. But it was the Filipino people, starved, beaten, yet unbroken, who kept the flame of resistance alive until he could return. As historian Teodoro Agoncillo later wrote, "In those years of darkness, when freedom seemed lost, the heart of the Filipino did not surrender. In the silence of the jungle, freedom learned to breathe again." A nation, rising from the ashes. September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay. Aboard the battleship USS Missouri, Japan's foreign minister signed the Instrument of Surrender. The war that had engulfed the world for 6 years was finally over. As the pens scratched across parchment, thousands of miles away in Manila, church bells rang through a ruined city. For the Philippines, liberation had come at an unbearable cost, but freedom, long deferred, was now reality. In the weeks that followed, MacArthur returned briefly to the islands he had fought so fiercely to reclaim. From the veranda of Malacañang Palace, overlooking the Pasig River, he addressed the nation. "You have known the darkest night, and now stand in the dawn. Together we have redeemed the pledge made in the days of your agony." The Philippines lay in ruins. 80% of Manila was destroyed, second only to Warsaw in wartime devastation. Roads were cratered, bridges collapsed, industries reduced to rubble. Yet amid the destruction, an unmistakable spirit surged. Families began rebuilding homes from the remains of churches and schools. Children played in the shadow of bombed buildings. Life, fragile but determined, pushed forward. The return of sovereignty. On July 4, 1946, under a bright Manila sun, the flag of the United States was lowered, and the Philippine flag rose to full mast. The crowd roared with pride. The Republic of the Philippines was reborn, sovereign and free after nearly half a millennium of colonial rule. President Manuel Roxas took the oath of office, his voice steady despite the scars that the war had left. "We have paid for our liberty in blood," he said, "and we shall defend it with courage and wisdom." Though independence had finally arrived, challenges loomed. The economy was shattered, veterans sought recognition, and the countryside still bore the marks of occupation. The U.S. extended the Bell Trade Act and the Military Bases Agreement, both controversial but necessary for rebuilding. American aid and training helped reconstruct schools, factories, and hospitals. MacArthur, now Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan, ensured that war reparations and reconstruction plans included assistance for the Philippines. He often referred to the nation as the spiritual heart of the Pacific War. The human cost. War had taken everything from millions. Between 1941 and 1945, over 1 million Filipinos perished, soldiers, guerrillas, and civilians alike. In towns like Balanga and San Fernando, survivors of the Bataan Death March wept at the simple wooden crosses marking the spots where comrades had fallen. In Manila, survivors of the massacre searched for loved ones among the ruins. Mass graves lined the city's outskirts. In villages across the islands, families who had hidden in caves during the Japanese occupation emerged to rebuild. For many, justice became the only solace. The war crimes trials held in Manila after 1945 brought dozens of Japanese officers before Allied tribunals. Testimonies revealed horrors beyond imagination: executions, forced labor, massacres. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commander of Japanese forces in the Philippines, was found guilty for failing to control his men during the Manila Massacre. His final statement before his execution in February 1946 was somber. "I have done my duty as a soldier. I pray that my death brings peace." For survivors, peace was not found in punishment alone, but in remembrance. Remembering Bataan and Corregidor, every April 9, the nation pauses for Araw ng Kagitingan, the Day of Valor. Veterans, soldiers, and civilians climb Mount Samat, where the massive white dambana ng Kagitingan, Shrine of Valor, towers over Bataan. The monument stands 302 feet high, a silent sentinel to those who fell in the march, the siege, and the jungle campaigns. At its base are the names of units and divisions that resisted to the end. Among them, both Filipino and American. Their brotherhood in suffering became the foundation of post-war alliance, an unbreakable bond forged not by treaty, but by shared sacrifice. In Corregidor's tunnels, rusting helmets and faded graffiti remain as relics of defiance. Tourists who walk through them today can still read words scrawled by desperate soldiers: "No surrender." These places became sacred ground, not merely memorials to death, but proof that freedom often comes at the highest cost. The Guerrilla Legacy. The guerrillas who had fought in silence during the occupation emerged as heroes of the people. Leaders like Luis Taruk of the Hukbalahap in central Luzon, Wendell Fertig in Mindanao, and the countless nameless fighters in the hills had kept the flame of resistance alive when hope seemed lost. Yet peace brought division. Many guerrilla units struggled for recognition or compensation. The Hooks, feeling betrayed, later turned their weapons against the new government, sparking a rebellion in the late 1940s. Still, their wartime valor remained unquestioned. They were the invisible army of liberation, the bridge between defeat and freedom. The American bond. The shared suffering of the war cemented the friendship between the Philippines and the United States. American veterans who fought in Bataan and Leyte returned decades later to lay wreaths beside their Filipino brothers-in-arms. MacArthur himself returned in 1951, older and grayer, to receive the Order of Sikatuna. Standing once more on Philippine soil, he said simply, "I shall return, again and again, as long as I live, in spirit, in memory, and in gratitude." Even after his death in 1964, the alliance he helped shape endured. Bases at Clark and Subic became symbols of partnership during the Cold War, and generations of Filipinos grew up hearing stories of their grandparents who fought beside the Americans. Echoes through generations. Today, the war's echoes remain. In the towns of Bataan, descendants of Death March survivors gather each year to walk a few symbolic kilometers in their honor. In Leyte Gulf, fishermen still dredge up fragments of ships and aircraft, silent artifacts of the greatest naval battle ever fought. In Manila, restored monuments and museums preserve the memory of 1945. The Intramuros walls, once shattered by shell fire, now stand rebuilt, carrying plaques inscribed with the words, "Let this remind us that peace is precious and freedom never free." For historians and veterans alike, the legacy of World War II in the Philippines is not one of tragedy alone, but of transcendence. It tells how ordinary men and women, faced with impossible odds, chose resistance over submission. The Spirit That Endured. In his post-war memoirs, General MacArthur reflected on his years in the Philippines. "It was here that I learned the meaning of courage, not from soldiers alone, but from a people whose faith never wavered even in the valley of the shadow of death. The true victors of that war were not generals or governments, but the farmers, students, nurses, and priests who refused to surrender, the housewives who hid guerrillas in their homes, the children who carried messages through rice fields under threat of execution. They became the quiet heroes of freedom. Epilogue: The Unbroken Flame. More than 80 years have passed since the first bombs fell on Clark Field, yet the story of the Philippines in World War II remains one of the most powerful chapters in human resilience. From Baton's death march to Leyte's redemption, from the ashes of Manila to the birth of independence, the Philippines endured the full arc of war: conquest, suffering, and ultimate liberation. On the eternal flame of the Shrine of Valor, a bronze plaque bears these words: "Sleep, heroes of Baton and Corregidor. Your nation remembers. Your courage lights our freedom." In that remembrance, the Philippines continues to stand, proud, sovereign, and unbroken,